Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us at Space Cowboy Books Online. I'm your host, Jean Paul. And this evening, we have with us A.C. Wise, author of the fantastic debut novel, Wendy Darling. A.C. Wise's fiction has appeared in publications such as Tor.com, Uncanny, Clark's World, among other places. Oop, gotta let some more people in. She has two collections published with Lethe Press and a novella published by Broken Eye Books. Her debut novel, Wendy Darling, was published by Titan Books earlier this month, and we'll have a link in the chat where you can find that. A new short story collection, The Ghost Sequences, is forthcoming from Undertow Books this October, and we'll also be taking pre-orders for that. We'll share a link in a minute. Her work won the Sunburst Award for Excellence in Canadian Literature of the Fantastic, has been a finalist for the Nebula, Sunburst, Aurora, and Lambda Awards. In addition to her fiction, she contributes a regular review column for Apex magazine, and her work as a reviewer has made her a finalist for the Ignite Awards in the Critics category. You can find her online at acwise.net, and we will also be sharing that link in a moment. So without further delay, I'm going to pass it on to AC Wise for a small taste of Wendy Darling.
Hello, and thank you so much for having me. I'm going to be reading a short excerpt from Wendy Darling. This is at the point where Wendy, as an adult who has grown up long after her time in Neverland, and she's now gone back to rescue her daughter Jane. And this is sort of one of her first encounters as an adult with Neverland, and sort of realizing that it's maybe not quite the paradise that she thought it was as a child. Wendy scans the canopy of trees for a glimpse of the brightly colored birds she remembers from when she was a child, the ones she heard chattering as she stood on the beach. They're eerily silent now, and she sees no sign of them, as if when she stepped beneath the trees they all fled. Wind sways in the treetops, a rippling hush. She catches a flicker of motion, but it isn't red or blue. It's a brownish gray, vanishing through the branches too fast for her to track. By the time she focuses on the spot where it was, it's already gone. She pulls her shawl closer, but the motion doesn't come again. The leaves cast shadow patterns on the forest floor. They shift with the breeze, but everything else is stillness. The air feels haunted, and Wendy feels watched. Even the trees seem paler, washed of their color somehow, the leaves almost translucent, like ghosts of themselves. She hurries her step until she's out from under the trees, looking at the rocky caldera surrounding the lagoon. It's right where she expected it. At least this part of Neverland hasn't changed. Tiny shells and fossils of starfish and insects stud the porous stone that surrounds the water and hides it from view. Wendy runs her finger over the stone. Jane would love this. She would probably know the name of every species embedded in the rock. She pulls her hand back, and it's a moment before she can breathe again for the ache in her chest. She removes her shawl and ties it around her waist, then unbuttons her cuffs and rolls her sleeves to the elbows. She checks her pockets. Everything is secure. Wendy reaches, and as she does, the rock molds itself to her grip, just as she remembers. She pushes off with one foot, pulling herself up, and searches for a spot to wedge the toe of her boot. Her limbs aren't as flexible as they used to be, but her fingers still find holds in all the right places. Like Neverland's trees, the rocks here understand adventure, a desire to be higher than everything else, king of the hill, or queen. There's a pleasant burn to climbing, and Wendy revels in it, the stretch of her muscles, the sweat gathering beneath her clothes. She welcomes the way her breath comes harder, so unlike anything she would do at home in London. There, her greatest exertion might be a stroll in the park or a game of croquet. But here, she is the Wendy again, the girl who flew. Exhilaration fills her, and just as soon, dread comes on its heels, tripping down her spine. A memory nags her, climbing a rock to a secret place. Something Peter showed her. But what? Something that made her afraid. At the top of the caldera, Wendy pauses. The breeze picks up a foul smell, one teetering on the edge of rot, carrying it to her from below. She should be able to hear the chatter of mermaid voices, the drifting melody of their song. There's only more silence, like there was on the beach. Light sparkles on the water below so that Wendy has to squint her eyes against it, but the water itself seems empty. Are the mermaids hiding from her? Or are they hiding from something else? Instinct screams at her to turn back, but even if she wanted to, gravity takes the choice from her hands. Her grip falters and she slides, stumbling down the incline towards the blue eye of the lagoon below. The breath rushes from her, and all Wendy can do is shield her face and try to slow her descent. Her foot catches on something, pain jolting up her leg, and for a moment she's airborne. Falling, not flying. Then she's crashing through the long grasses and wild sea roses bordering the lagoon, the bruising violence of her impact driving the rest of the breath from her body. She rolls to a stop just at the edge of the water. A whine emerges and she sucks in a breath, coughing, and for a moment she's sure she'll suffocate, drowning on dry land. The blue sky mocks her from above, clear and perfect and bright, but every part of her body aches. It's a moment before she can roll over, planting her hand to lever herself up. Her palm slips in slick weed and foul mud, the sources of the stench, plunging her arm into the water and bringing her eye to empty eye socket with a skull glaring up at her from the shore. Wendy scrambles back, pain momentarily forgotten. The skeleton lies with one arm flung outward, the other tucked beneath its chin, head pillowed on sun-bleached bones. The lower half of the body trails into the water, which is so still and so painfully clear that below the torso she can see the bones of a powerful tail, stripped of its shimmering scales. Wendy crawls forward, stopping just short of touching the skull. It's impossible. She can't be seeing what she's seeing, despite the evidence in front of her eyes. Nothing can die in Neverland. Peter told her so. But here's the skull, incontrovertible, her own truth against Peter's, and she's done taking other people's words for how the world functions. Her fingers hover in the space above the pale curve of bone. There should be thick, shining tresses bound with seashells, woven with coral and sea roses. She lets her hand fall. Who was this? Wendy struggles to call to mind each mermaid's face, almost human, but at the same time strangely other. Their pointed chins, their cheekbones sharp and canted, and their eyes shimmering like mother of pearl. The memories were so clear once, but now, when she needs them the most, she finds them dulled. Voices raised in song ring in her head, paired with the musical tones of their names sung to her from the water the first time she met them. Sea bloom, salt rose, coral bramble. In the lagoon's depths, there are more skeletons. Dozens of them, some entangled, some alone, some seeming as though they simply dropped through the current as they swam. A gull screams and Wendy jumps. The cutout shape of the bird's wings passes across the cloudless blue as she looks up, and she shudders to think what the curved tip of its beak has been feeding on. Grief-fueled rage leaves her arms trembling, but she scoops up the first stone she can find and hurls it at the bird. The stone goes wide, arcing back into the water, breaking the still surface so wavelets lap the bones at her feet. A choked sob catches in Wendy's throat as the bird glides on, oblivious. She closes her eyes, breathing against the tightness in her chest. And now, when she no longer wants it, memory comes flooding back, conjuring the feel of fingers combing through her hair, the susurrus of gossip passing as flashing tails fan the water. The mermaids knew every inch of the secret underground tunnels lacing through the water beneath the island. They could cross it in a flash, carrying news from one shore to the other. There was a time when the birds were their allies, bringing scraps of news in a language Wendy could never understand. Now Wendy imagined those tunnels clogged with more bones, death under her feet threaded through every part of the island. It isn't just the mermaids' deaths. She selfishly mourns their knowledge, their news. She's certain they could have told her where to find Jane. She opens her eyes. The memory of a song hangs over the lagoon, the last note on a wind instrument, unplayed. Wendy brushes at her trousers ineffectually, only succeeding in smearing more mud on the fabric. Another choked sound, half laughter, tasting of salt, and Wendy scrubs at her eyes. What could kill so many so quickly? And why didn't Peter stop it? And that is where I'm going to stop.
Thank you for sharing that excerpt with us. Now we're going to move into the interview section of the event. If any of the audience has questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and I'm sure we'll have time to get to them. So, much of Wendy Darling is about the plight of women in the early 20th century. What made you decide to use the backdrop of Peter Pan to show this situation?
I think there's sort of a lot of things that naturally led to that being a good framework for exploring those themes. I mean, the fact that it's sort of a portal fantasy, and I've always been kind of fascinated with the idea of, what happens after a character comes back from a fantasy world that very few people have access to and, nobody else really believes in. And that sort of led into the idea of, whose voice is listened to, who gets to tell their truth and be believed. So when Wendy comes back from Neverland as a child, she tells everybody exactly where she's been. She doesn't try to keep Neverland a secret. She tells them she's been to this wonderful fantasy land and nobody believes her. And she spends, a good chunk of her life with people telling her that she's a liar, that she's gotten things wrong, that she's imagined things. So it sort of led into that idea of, even if it isn't intentional gaslighting all the time, basically almost everybody in her life, and unfortunately the majority of them are the men in her life, are kind of trying to impose their truth on her and tell her, this is the way the world is, you're imagining things, and it ends up getting her put away as a difficult woman because she keeps trying to assert her own truth and, tell the world as she sees it, and nobody believes her. So I thought that was sort of, the idea of a portal fantasy was kind of a natural framework for that kind of story. And even just, the idea of Neverland itself, when Peter takes her there, he takes her there to be a mother to the lost boys. And it's kind of, his very strict definition of, this is what a mother is. A mother tells stories and cooks and cleans and, takes care of her children. And she kind of realizes, that there's this whole paradise world for children where there are no rules, no grown-ups to tell them, bedtime, eat vegetables, that kind of thing, except there are rules for her and nobody else. So again, she's kind of being treated differently because she's a girl. So it's the idea of, it's a paradise for a lot of people, but not a paradise for everybody. Some people are left out of that paradise. So again, it felt like sort of a natural story to be a framework for that kind of exploration of, what a lot of women in the early 20th century might have experienced and might still be experiencing now, as being different rules for one set of people versus another set of people.
And you touched on this a little bit in your answer, but can you tell us a little bit about Wendy's transformation into adulthood and the struggle to let go of Neverland throughout the backdrop of the hardships of World War I?
Absolutely. I mean, I sort of wanted to explore the idea of childhood and growing up, and kind of having, in a way, Wendy's journey towards adulthood in a little bit be contrasted to Peter as a boy who never grows up, but also mirroring it in a way. because of all the experiences Wendy went through, being disbelieved and being put away for her beliefs, she really clings to childhood very hard in a lot of ways. She kind of uses Neverland as a bit of a shield against the world and kind of a place that she retreats to cope with the harshness of her reality, including um, you know World War I and all the horrors that come with that. And at a certain point, her brother Michael, the youngest of the darling children, actually enlists as a soldier. He goes and fights on the front lines of World War I and has a very direct experience with that. And she doesn't understand why he's not also, using Neverland as a shield, why he actually doesn't remember Neverland at all. She can't comprehend why he wouldn't want to retreat into those happier memories. And at a certain point, she realizes, his experience of the war is very different from hers. He's sort of directly on the front lines faced with this. And he kind of can't let go of, the horrors, the reality that he's seen. And it sort of eventually leads her to realize that her own retreat into her version of reality is actually hurting other people. And it kind of leads her into, being a more empathetic and kind of that idea of growing up being, dealing with consequences, seeing a world that's wider than her own, very narrow focused point of view. Um, I didn't really want Wendy to be a selfish character, but at the same time, there is definitely sort of a self-centeredness to her worldview a lot of time because of the trauma that she's been through. Um, but also, she is a little bit mature in some ways, and she does have to grow up over the course of the novel and realize, the world is bigger than just her. There are other people with points of view who are, their points of view are equally valid. And she kind of has to realize where other people are coming from and have a little bit more empathy and be an adult in that way, which she, hadn't really had to before.
And can you speak about the metaphor that you use in the book of Peter's shadow, and how and is this related to the concept of the shadow self?
Yeah, so I sort of like the idea of, the shadow being kind of like, the darker aspects of a person. And that is definitely something that, you see in a lot of fiction, with people literally having to, fight their shadow selves, or, fight their evil clone, or fight a mirror universe version of themselves. Thinking of, like, Luke Skywalker having to go into the cave on Dagobah and fight what he thinks is Darth Vader, that he then realizes is actually himself. Um, so I wanted kind of that, but twisted a little bit, in that, in the original Peter Pan, Peter is, a character that occasionally becomes separated from his shadow. And I kind of want to look at not as something he's actively fighting, but something he's kind of stepping away from and avoiding. Um, and that's kind of part of, I see him in a lot of ways as sort of abdicating responsibility, where sort of Wendy realizes she has a responsibility to other people and to see their point of view. Peter is kind of the opposite of that in a way, in that he's trying to just walk away from it all and leave it all behind and kind of leave the consequences for somebody else to deal with. And that's kind of, you know, the way I saw him, as not just, separating from his shadow because he's kind of an otherworldly creature, but because he's actually actively trying to distance himself from those darker aspects of himself and not see them at all.
And in both stories, Wendy sewing the shadow back on. Can you talk about your use of the metaphors of sewing and repair that are alluded to throughout the entire book?
Yeah, I mean, sewing, I always kind of knew that would be a very central aspect to Wendy's character, both in the literal and the metaphorical sense. I really like the idea of exploring Wendy as a hero who kind of uses unconventional skills to deal with her problems. I've always kind of liked looking at, characters who are heroic and, save the day and face problems, but it's not necessarily because they're picking up a sword or they're punching their problems in the face. Um, and I specifically wanted, one of Wendy's particular skills that kind of lead into her heroism and her problem solving to be something that was very much associated with the feminine arts, as it were. and to have that be a strength. There's kind of, you know, a whole thing where sort of sewing is seen as kind of, you know, a woman's art, which you know, by comparison or implication kind of makes it lesser. Um, in my day job, I work in museums, and there is kind of like a debate in the art world about what counts as art and what counts as craft. And a lot of, again, the traditionally, you know, women's skills or things associated with women as creators kind of get dismissed as, oh, you know, that's just craft. Anybody could do it, but true artists are, you know, the rare geniuses, and those are always men. Um, and I realize that's a little bit of a tangent to the point, but again, I sort of wanted that, you know, traditionally feminine thing to be associated with Wendy, but to be a strength and a special skill that she had that allows her to take on her problems. But at the same time, in kind of the more metaphorical sense, she is kind of, you know, trying to stitch together her various experiences in Neverland, her various perceptions of reality, and kind of make a whole out of them that leads her to realizing that things aren't quite as starkly this or that, good or bad, she believed them to be, but that kind of everything is a little bit of a mosaic of different aspects that make up the whole picture. Um, and also kind of in her relationship with Michael, she, you know, kind of spends a lot of time thinking about how she can't stitch up his wounds because his worst wounds are the psychological trauma he's dealing with from being a soldier. Um, and so that sort of thread of sewing, repair, stitching, fixing just kind of runs all throughout Wendy's character and is very central to, you know, who she is as a person.
And the concept of that you mentioned in the art world of art versus craft, do you find that this is an issue that's affected women in the world of literature and writing?
I think so. I mean, there's that whole, and I'm going to very badly misquote things, but the how to suppress women's writing, you know, she wrote it but she shouldn't have, she wrote it but did she really write it, she wrote it but maybe she should have written about something else. You know, there's that idea that women's writing kind of isn't as serious, or it's a bit more niche, or you know, it should be kind of divided off in its own section where men's stories are kind of taken by default to be more universal. Um, and that's true of, you know, anybody who's kind of part of a marginalized identity. Like, you know, stories about white people are obviously universal, but obviously, you know, stories by Black authors have to be in a special interest section, or, you know, queer stories have to be, you know, in their own separate thing because nobody, you know, nobody straight could possibly relate to them. Um, so it's definitely, you know, a larger discussion, and something that affects, you know, anybody again who's part of a marginalized identity.
I read this book partly about being a man who refuses to grow up, in contrast to the boy who can never grow old. Um, and then again contrasted with Wendy's transition into adulthood. Can you talk about how you handled these concepts and how they contrasted with each other?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually on a panel recently with three other authors who also happen to have works either out or coming out this year that are inspired by Peter Pan. Something kind of interesting came up as like a central concept, which is kind of whether we view Peter as a character who's worthy of our sympathy, or whether we view him as a character who's kind of a villain and deserving of contempt, depends on whether you see him as a child or an adult. Um, which I think sort of comes back to what you're saying a little bit about, you know, a man who refuses to grow up versus a child who can't grow up. Um, is Peter innocent or is he guilty? And kind of the way I dealt with him as a character is a little bit of both, which might be a cop out, but I did kind of want to have that dichotomy of, you know, there is sort of a certain element of innocence to him, and there is, you know, some stuff about him that is worthy of sympathy, but I also didn't want to let him totally off the hook. Um, and I did try to contrast a little bit, you know, with Wendy's journey to kind of a greater empathy with the rest of the world and her accepting responsibility for the way her actions impact other people, with the idea of Peter kind of always stepping away from that responsibility and letting other people deal with the consequences of what he does. Um, I feel like growing up in a way is sort of the idea of accepting consequences in a way, or of realizing that, the world is more than just you. I think there is something a little inherently selfish about children. And obviously that's not universal, but I feel like there are sort of a lot of kids that, they kind of first have to understand that, like, I am a thing, and, their world is kind of like what affects them directly. And eventually there's kind of that realization of like, oh, other things are individual human beings too, and the things that I do impact those people. And it's kind of a worldview you get a little bit more as you grow up. And again, that doesn't apply to all children or all adults either. Some people never learn that, but I did want to sort of show, Wendy kind of more and more realizing the way her actions have impacted other people, and that being part of her growing up journey, um, as opposed to Peter, who's just kind of constantly avoiding that and being, the boy who doesn't grow up / refuses to grow up.
And what, if any, challenges did you face in dealing with writing children's characters, and the difference in writing children versus adults, and their entrapment in this world of the unreal?
I mean, I didn't really necessarily face any challenges, but that may just be sort of, the way I approached the story. I feel like kind of all the characters that I have that are children themselves, especially when it comes to, Peter or the Lost Boys, I sort of wanted to have that idea of, perpetual innocence, but they're also kind of trapped in that. And despite the fact that, they never grow up in Neverland, time still does pass. So every now and then, those characters kind of, catch glimpses of the fact that they've lived much longer than their physical forms implied that they have. And they kind of bring that a bit of adult perspective of, oh, some of this is actually a little bit horrifying, and we don't really want to be here. And in terms of kind of adapting characters from a children's story to a more adult audience, I feel like the darkness is kind of always implied in the original children's story. And I really just wanted to surface that. And, the book was always sort of intended to be aimed at an adult audience. And I wanted, the characters to kind of be recognizable from the original, but also to put my own spin on it. Um, so far, nobody's come back and said they absolutely hate what I've done, at least not that I've heard. So I haven't, faced like a huge amount of pushback in terms of like, you did wrong by the characters, or how dare you put this much darkness into a story that was originally intended as a children's story. Maybe that's coming, I don't know, but so far it hasn't been a huge challenge. And again, I feel like, there's so many creepy elements to the original that, especially kind of when you look back on it as an adult, you kind of see that bits of that darkness were always there. Like, this boy serially kidnaps other children. That's kind of dark.
The darkness did translate quite well, and I found the scenarios with the Lost Boys to be really tragic. And now I'm looking at the original story completely differently through the lens of this book, which is wonderful. Um, so again, you touched on this a little bit, but in some ways, this book is about dealing with inner dichotomies, and also attempting to hold on to the imagination of youth into adulthood. Could you elaborate on those concepts?
Sure. I mean, I think, again, going with the sort of dichotomy theme, I wanted to try to show at least, both sides of like how kind of focusing on happy memories or kind of projecting yourself backwards into a happier, more innocent time can be, a way of coping with trauma or coping with current stresses in your life, but can also be, a thing that could harm other people as you maybe, retreat too far. Who are you leaving behind in your current life when you do something like that? I think there is sort of, a tendency for a lot of people to sort of idealize childhood or to idealize the past, um, on a larger level. And maybe that's sort of like, the grass is always greener. Obviously, the past is this like wonderful golden time that I would like to return to. But, not everybody had sort of that happy childhood. And when you look at it sort of on a societal level, a past that was ideal for some people was a time that it was, literally illegal for other people to be who they were, or, there was institutionalized violence against certain groups. So, that idealized past is obviously not ideal for everyone. And I kind of wanted to take that larger concept and sort of show it sort of on a macro scale, I guess, or like on a personal scale, as it were. The way sort of Wendy at times retreats into her idealized past, leaves other people out and hurts other people. The way Peter kind of holds on to an idealized childhood, hurts other people. Um, and actually, as I was kind of thinking over, um, my answer to this question, I was actually thinking about the way WandaVision kind of dealt with themes like that too. And I thought that was kind of interesting in that, like, Wanda literally, recreates that very idealized, television version of the 50s, then the 60s, and then the 70s. And it's this very like clean, perfect version. And that's how she deals with, her personal trauma. And then you kind of pull back from that and see all the other people that she's hurting. And presumably, even if we never see it on screen, kind of that realization is something she's going to have to carry forward into the world of like, oh, I hurt all these other people with, the way I was trying to protect myself. So there is kind of that, two sides of it. Yes, it is kind of a way to process your own trauma, but again, nobody exists in a vacuum. Whatever you do does have that impact on other people. And that is part of, growing up, realizing that kind of thing. So that is definitely something I wanted to play with and explore and try to a certain degree to show a bit of both sides of it, through the novel and through Wendy's journey.
And speaking of idealizing the past, I found the scenes, your depictions of the sanitarium that Wendy ends up in after Neverland, quite vivid. Can you talk a little bit about the research or how you came about writing these scenes?
Sure. So I tried to do, some research to see, what kind of mental health care and what institutions like that would have been like at that time. And at the same time, I also did take some liberties to try to serve my story. That's part of why I kind of had her be in a private sanitarium, as opposed to kind of a public health institution. That way I figured I kind of get away with a few more things that, I wanted certain things to happen in order to kind of fit in with my story. And I figured, a private institution that was kind of, under the control of one person might have certain practices that were a little more throwback, and certain things that wouldn't necessarily happen, in a public health institution at that time. Sort of, to a certain degree, the idea of like, them each having private rooms versus massive wards, or kind of the lack of control over some aspects of the patient's care that gets experienced by Wendy. There's sort of one doctor in charge of the whole thing. And then, if he's not directly looking over people, people can kind of get away with stuff. And some of the treatments are a little more, um, I guess, archaic versus what might have been actually practiced at the time. So, there was a little bit of fudging that went on to serve the story.
They were quite vivid scenes. The horror came across really accurately, I feel like. We've got a question from the audience here. This one is from Gabriel. I'm curious about how you handled the Lost Boys in this story. What was your angle to reimagine them as opposed to the original?
Part of my inspiration was actually drawn from Lord of the Flies. I've kind of, fascinated by the idea of like children, and I guess specifically a group of boys, sort of out of the control of parental supervision or any kind of adult supervision. And, you know, how fast would they go feral, basically? And it's a little bit of sort of, the playground rules, the way, children of any gender kind of, as they're sort of trying to figure out their own places in the world, unfortunately, a lot of them will kind of identify, who are the weaker ones, and, band together to pick on those kids in order to kind of, keep themselves safe. Like if I'm the attacker, I can't be the attacked one. Um, so the way that was kind of done in Lord of the Flies is a little bit of the inspiration that I drew on for my version of the Lost Boys. And I guess, as I said a little bit before, I did kind of want to have that idea of innocence and freedom, but also sort of that realization every now and then that we're being kept here against our will. Maybe this isn't as idyllic as we think it is. And, it's ideal for some people who kind of maybe have that natural bullying instinct to kind of pick on the weaker ones in the group, but then the weaker ones in the group every now and then are kind of realizing that, oh, we are the bottom of the food chain here, and this isn't a paradise for us. This is just an excuse where there's nobody around who can protect us, and we're getting picked on and bullied, and nobody's doing anything to stop it. Um, so I just kind of found that, to be an interesting social situation, I guess, to play with. How children behave when there's nobody around to stop them.
You also built a wonderful contrast between the boys playing at war and then the scars of war with adult men, and the drastic differences between our playtime and reality. Can you expand on that? And were those contrasts intentional?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of, an interesting glorification of war and violence in a lot of play and a lot of toys that are aimed at children, and I guess that are specifically marketed towards boys. When you think of, things like GI Joe, and even to like Nerf guns and stuff like that, there's a lot of stuff that, is actually really quite horrifying when you think about it, but that's sort of designed for play. And maybe that's, subconsciously, like, these are the trying to kind of adults we're trying to build by exposing this to children young. Or maybe it's even just sort of trivializing it in a way that's like, oh, it doesn't really matter. Of course, everybody likes violence, and this is as a play thing, and it doesn't really mean anything. Um, but I sort of wanted to show, specifically with Michael, kind of how that you know extreme contrast of like playing at war, and then as a soldier, kind of, there's at some point, you know, there's kind of the realization that the boys that never grew up in Michael's actual experience of reality, it's because, those were all the young soldiers that died. It's not, some magical, wonderful land where everything is perfect and everybody heals from their wounds. It's actually because they're never going to get the chance to grow up because they're, rotting in their graves. So I sort of wanted to show that, contrast between the way, war is kind of glorified as this fun thing for kids sometimes, but it is actually this really, horrific thing. And we send children out to fight, and, expect them to be able to cope with it. And maybe if they're lucky, they come home, or they die young. And even if they come home with scars and are expected to reintegrate into normal life. But nothing's ever going to be normal for them again, which in a way is actually kind of a weird, very twisted version, I guess, of a portal fantasy when you think about it. They go to this totally other world and experience this thing that is completely different from everyday life for most people, and then they're expected to come home and behave as if they've never been there and everything is normal. So
So, in many ways, I found for me this book was about, and I'm going to quote from the book here: boys who never face consequences. Could you tell us a bit more about this and the deep, rich feminist angle of the novel?
sure, that's definitely something I wanted to explore. Who gets to abdicate responsibility in the world and who has to face consequences. And I was kind of thinking a lot of like things like the Me Too movement, or just sort of, the way domestic violence, abuse, rape tends to be treated. And again, I realized that, what I'm talking about here is sort of a subset of things. And it's not always the case that, men are the abusers and women are the ones who are abused, and there's many other shades to things. But in a lot of the cases that we see where, a woman is the victim of a crime, and the man is the perpetrator of a crime, we get things like, oh, boys will be boys, or he didn't mean it, or, oh, you just misunderstood, or you're taking this too seriously, can't you take a joke? And that sort of again and again in the narratives that you see about these cases in the media or the way they're reported on kind of gives the perpetrator of the crime sort of every excuse to get out of it, or every excuse why it wasn't really that serious, why it's been misunderstood, why they didn't really do what we thought they did, or whatever the case may be. So they kind of get to abdicate that responsibility. Whereas the way it's sort of reported on the victim side of it is, well, what was she wearing? Was she drinking? Did she smile at him too much? Did she lead him on? Did she not smile enough? Maybe if she'd been nicer, maybe if she'd acted differently. So all the responsibility ends up being shifted from the person who actually perpetrated the crime to the person, who's impacted by the crime. And it again and again sort of reinforces that narrative that there are never going to be consequences for the actual perpetrators of the crime, which, is a bad thing for basically everybody involved. It doesn't exactly create an environment where, the people who might have been prone to, be bullies in the schoolyard could ever actually grow out of that if they sort of learn over and over again, oh, there's never going to be consequences for my actions. What I did isn't actually all that serious. It didn't actually hurt anybody because it's that other person's fault, not mine. So why would they ever, grow out of that attitude of I can do whatever I want, and it's not going to hurt me and it's not going to hurt anybody else. So why would I ever grow and change and develop empathy? Versus the other side, who's kind of forced to bear all the responsibility when they did absolutely nothing wrong. So I kind of wanted to look at that, through Wendy and Peter's characters. And again, going back to what I said before of, Peter kind of constantly stepping away from responsibility, and being allowed to do that, where, Wendy's never allowed to completely step away from her responsibility and to, be completely blameless in a situation. And it does actually lead her to grow, whereas Peter is perpetually the boy who never grows up because nobody's ever told him no. He's never faced consequences. And I feel like that is kind of reflective of a lot of stereotypical gender roles even today, unfortunately.
And I don't want to give the audience any spoilers for those that haven't read the book, but there's some really interesting relationships and dynamics between Wendy and some of the other characters. But I'd love to ask, maybe in private sometime, because I don't want to give spoilers for the book. But I do want to ask before we go tonight, what's coming up next for you? What other books should we keep a lookout for? And you mentioned a sequel to Wendy Darling. If you're at liberty to discuss that, I'd love to hear more about that.
Sure. So I am currently working on an as yet untitled sequel to Wendy Darling. At the moment, it's just kind of planned to be a duology, but the second book does continue both Wendy's story and her daughter Jane's story, but does also go back to pick up Captain Hook's story and kind of fill in some of the details there that, you'll see hints at it in the first book. But it sort of fills in everything that happened to him. And I kind of found him another interesting character as kind of, one of the primary adults that stuck in Neverland, and kind of, how does that whole thing work in a land where grown-ups aren't supposed to be allowed, and the idea that, he's designed to be Peter's perfect villain. So I kind of wanted to explore all of that. Again, that's kind of farther out in the future, no release date yet, no title, but stay tuned and I will share that information as soon as I have it. Closer to on the horizon, as you mentioned in the intro, I do have a short story collection coming out this October, just in time for Halloween. It is called The Ghost Sequences, and it is all sort of haunting, ghostly, more horror focused stories, and that's coming from Undertow Books. And I'll also have kind of another handful of short stories possibly out later this year, but I'm not sure of release dates and which ones I'm allowed to talk about and which ones I'm not. So I guess if anybody's interested in following those, I'll post it on Twitter or it'll be on my website.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you, AC Wise. Got to read Wendy Darling, a fantastic novel. We've put links in the chat to that book as well as the Ghost Sequences, which will be coming out in October. Thank you so much for joining us. Hope to meet you in person sometime, and good evening to our audience.